The transition is made from the form of the one or unit into that of universality, from one absolute abstraction into the other, from the purpose of pure being for self, which has thrown off all community with others, into the sheer opposite, which is thus equally abstract being in itself. Consequently, the form in which this appears is that the individual has simply perished, and the absolute unyieldingness of individual existence is pulverized on the equally unrelenting but continuous world of actuality. Since it is, as consciousness, the unity of itself and its opposite, this downfall is still for it its goal and realization, as also the contradiction of what was for it essence and what is in itself essence. It experiences the double meaning implicit in what it did, that is, when it took hold of life and possessed it, but in doing so it really laid hold of death. What we discovered in the last paragraph, and Hegel laid this out in considerable detail, was that the drive or the pursuit of pleasure as the meaning for consciousness of its individuality, its happiness, turns out to be not only empty in the classic sense of revealing to us that it's not the highest good or anything like that, but that there's an emptiness within it that reveals that it simply cannot provide the sort of fulfillment that it is that the human subject is looking for. And instead there is this interesting transition to the pure category. And Hegel talked about three categories in particular. And we're going to talk about that here and how those still pervade this paragraph, which is 364. Now we're on the other side of this equation between pleasure and necessity. And what we're going to see is that Hegel tells us that not only does necessity come in inevitably in this attempt to try to work out this gestalt of pleasure seeking, but that it cannot actually be, you might say, reconciled or processed at this point. Integrated would be another way of putting it, with what is going on in terms of fate, in terms of necessity, here in terms of universality. So you notice that we've got this transition happening from the one or the unit, as he says, to the universality. We have this complete shift. And notice as well that this is all happening within consciousness, which is connecting all of these together. So what is going on here? If we read between the lines and we think about what happened in the last paragraph, we have the one or the unit, right? Unity, the category of unity. And then we have the category of distinction or difference or something else coming in, Unterschied, right? So we have, Einheit, Unterschied, and then we have the relation between both of them, holding them together, even as they separate out from each other and distinguish each other, against each other. We have the Beziehung, which is consciousness itself. And at this point, Hegel continues to speak of a contradiction, a Widerspruch, in the heart of consciousness. So I didn't put too much else up on the board, but all the things that he's saying in this passage, this paragraph, refer to this. And this is indeed the play of those empty categories, or empty essentialities that he was talking about in the last paragraph. So Hegel says we make this transition from the form of the one into that of universality, pleasure into necessity, from one absolute abstraction into the other. Now notice that he's not saying, from the concrete to the abstract, because what did we discover in looking at pleasure, at least through Hegel's eyes? Pleasure itself is like sense certainty. It seems like it's the most concrete, the most in your face. We can start with this because at least we know what this is. As a matter of fact, this reminds me of, when Cicero has his characters squaring off against each other, and one of them says, well, how do you define pleasure? And the other guy says, this is roughly paraphrasing, what are you talking about? You don't know what pleasure is? So there's that common reaction, but Hegel doesn't stop there. Hegel says, no, pleasure is abstract. So we have abstract being for itself. We have abstract being in itself. And he goes on and he says, we have transition from one absolute abstraction into the other from the purpose of pure being for self, which has thrown off all community with others. Remember, even back before this pleasure and necessity section, earlier in the introductory stuff, we saw that the individual sort of threw off the ethical community, the ethical substance, the mores, the laws, and said, look, that stuff's great. Put it aside for a minute. I'm going to seek my happiness. And so the individual did that in what comes to mind first, which is pleasure. And this is this pursuit of pure being for self. It's not just enough to enjoy. One also, in trying to understand the truth of pleasure, wants to grasp one's own enjoyment in how it takes place. And when we do that, we discover, and this is something that Plato brings to mind, for example, in the Symposium. Plato, instead of saying, don't look at beautiful bodies, says, yeah, look at them all you want. Because what you're going to realize after a while is that they all have something in common with each other, something that exceeds the beautiful body. Beauty. Beauty of what? Well, that's not quite determined at this point. But the beauty is there for us to take pleasure in, and we can go on in other examples. But the transition is what's important here. So he says, pure being for self, which threw off all community with others, into the sheer opposite, which is thus equally abstract being in itself. And we could think about this, what is this over here? This is fate, this is necessity. We could understand this in terms of, physical necessity. You take, for example, shooting up heroin, right? If you do that, it's going to be intensely pleasurable for a while, and then you get addicted. And now you're living a life which is, punctuated highs of pleasure with a lot of pain of different sorts. And it's pretty rare that it turns out okay for people who become addicted to heroin, right? And you can say, the physical effects, they work on your body. Let's say there's sort of meth as well. I mean, look at the before and after pictures, and we look at what happens to people who become addicted to those sorts of things. They end up as a husk, right? And you can say, that's because of the effect of the chemicals, and, there's a physical necessity taking place. Far more important than that is what we might call the realm of social or cultural fate or necessity. So now let's put aside, addiction to hard drugs or stuff like that. By pursuing pleasure as the fundamental good, we can cut ourselves off from so much. And it's not just that, society doesn't like you to pursue pleasure, so, they're going to put a damper on you and crush you or anything like that. No, the mechanisms tend to be much more complex, and the narratives tend to be, more complicated than that. I'm reminded when thinking about this, and we could come up with all sorts of examples along these lines, of a John Cougar Mellencamp song, Paper in Fire. If you read the verses or just listen to the song, it talks about people who are, in fact, trying to make their life good by pursuing pleasure, and they're doing so in a way that has to do with other people. And they even get what they're after, but it all burns up like paper in fire. And then he's got a sort of caution in the third verse for the young people who don't understand that, days of vanity can go on forever, and the grass looks greener on the other side. And if we pursue it, we're going to end up like just finding a burnt, brown field. And this is where we arrive when we try to be that shape of consciousness, that gestalt, which is locating the good, locating meaning, locating the truth in in pleasure and in the possession and the enjoyment of pleasure. So we wind up with fate over here, abstract being in itself. He goes on and he says, consequently, the form in which this appears is that the individual has simply perished, and the absolute unyieldingness of individual existence is pulverized on the equally unrelenting but continuous world of actuality. That's the way we often depict it to ourselves, right? The individual, the whole. The whole doesn't really care about the individual. It makes it the individual a part and then sucks everything out of it and then throws it away. Sort of like ants in a colony, I suppose, or other social insects of that sort, right? That's not all that's going on here, though, Hegel is saying. So he goes on and he says, what's the key thing binding them together? It's consciousness. And the consciousness is the consciousness of an individual. It's not just consciousness writ large in the laws, the mores, and the narratives which say, hey, don't be Prometheus, because look what happens to that poor bastard when he steals the fire from Zeus. He winds up, imprisoned. We have a conflict of rights and wrongs, and some people end up on the wrong side of the stick when it comes to who's going to get punished for it. There's that, but we can also think of it in terms of the individual consciousness, not just a group consciousness. The individual consciousness realizes that it is being confronted with necessity. Insofar as that's the case, the individual consciousness is not completely gone. Even in the woe is me, for I now realize that in taking my pleasure, I set myself up for whatever, fate awaits me. That's still me saying all that stuff, thinking all that stuff. So he goes on and he says, since it is, as consciousness, the unity of itself and its opposite, this downfall is still, for it, its goal and realization. Now, this is interesting because what we're seeing is that there is something inherent about the pursuit of pleasure that leads to this downfall, not just as a consequence, but as an end, a tzvek, and as a realization. The truth of pleasure turns out not to be that, it's a hell of a lot of fun, or you can get it wherever you want, just pluck it like the grape, right? But rather that we end up in the throes of necessity. So he says, this is its golden realization, as also the contradiction of what was for it essence and what is in itself essence. There isn't just a single essence here, or you might say essence is revealing to us in this process, this transition and transformation, that essence has more than one side. And one side of it, the essential, turns out to be this fate. So he says it experiences the double meaning implicit in what it did. That is, when it took hold of life and possessed it. In doing so, it really laid hold of death. What is this very dramatic language? No, Hegel is using death here to talk about what is not living, the abstraction. And we just saw that fate or necessity in the paragraph before this is what we don't grasp, we don't understand. It just confronts us. So now what else is to be said about that? Now we have to look at the next two paragraphs. This transition of its living being into a lifeless necessity therefore appears to it as an inversion which is not mediated by anything at all. The mediating agency would have to be that in which both sides would be one, where therefore consciousness recognized one moment in the other. Its purpose and action in fate, and its fate in its purpose and action. That is, would recognize its own essence in this necessity. But this unity is, for this consciousness, just pleasure itself, or the simple single feeling. And the transition from the moment of this, its purpose, into the moment of its true essence, is for it a sheer leap into its antithesis. For these moments are not contained and linked together in feeling, but only in the pure self, which is a universal or thought. Consciousness, therefore, through its experience in which it should have found its truth, has really become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deeds are for it not the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence, presented now as the content and essence, and again as object or outwardly beheld essence of itself. The abstract necessity, therefore, has the character of the merely negative, uncomprehended power of universality, on which individuality is smashed to pieces. What Hegel is now charting out for us in paragraph 365 is a failure. A failure at this point, which is not going to remain a failure when we move to the next gestalt, the next shape of consciousness, in discussing, the law of the heart, the frenzy of self-conceit, which is just 2 paragraphs from here. But in this paragraph, what we see is that mediation doesn't take place the way that one would hope that it would. And, this is a great reminder, by the way, that, when people think about the Hegelian process or Hegelian dialectic, and it's always, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, this nice flowing movement through the ages and all that, that's really a gross oversimplification. What we see here, what we see actually much more often, what we see here is an antithesis, but it's something different. He's talking about these as being entgegengesetzte, not just opposed to each other, but, set off against each other, and both of them being there. You might say it this way, not to get too deep into this, that not all antitheses are antithetical in the same way. And how is this going to occur at this point? How are we going to get a kind of blockage which is going to require us to slip beyond? Well, he's talking about the living being and this transition to necessity, as we talked about in the previous paragraph. He says, this transition of its living being into a lifeless necessity appears to it as an inversion which is not mediated by anything at all. And so this mediation here is really going to be illusory, and it's illusory in 2 ways. The first is that there is no mediation at this point. The things are just antithetical. They are entgegengesetzte, right? They're set off against each other without any resolution, without any reconciliation in sight, in this, at least. Which means that the person pursuing pleasure in this way is always going to be somewhat of a tortured individual. Tortured by their own estrangement, their own alienation from themselves. But that's a separate issue, right? The other is that there is an attempt to try to find what's going to mediate it, and it turns out to be totally inadequate to be the mediator. So what does Hegel go on and say? He says, the mediating agency, here's the criteria for what would have to be a mediating agency, would have to be that in which both sides would be one, would be unified, would be brought together, right? Where, therefore, consciousness recognized one moment in the other. And the way that he talks about this is in terms of action and purpose. So that if we want to say that this action on the part of individuality and the purpose of the action somehow is in a mediation with this other thing that is confronting it, this whatever we're going to construe that as, that means that we need to, as he says, be able to find the purpose and the action in fate and find the fate in the purpose and the action. And, what would be examples of this? Well, when somebody says, I've understood what my destiny is, it's to go on and save the nation, right? Let's take, these great, Roman heroes of the past, the early republic, and even before that, during the time of Romulus, and then the kings, and they're recorded in these deeds of famous men, right? And there's some pretty cool stories in there, and those are people where they're doing something, and there's an intention there. Like think of these confrontations with the other local peoples. Well, it's part of a fate, a greater thing, which is the Roman community, and it's spread across Italy, kicking the Greeks out, kicking the Etruscans out, conquering the Sabines, conquering these people, conquering those. Well, that is one way in which we can identify what we're doing with something bigger than ourselves, as we say, right? There's an action, there's a purpose of the action, and it doesn't just end there. There's a fate or a destiny, this larger thing that encompasses it. Now let's take something a bit more close to, I think, many of us. My fate is to, take something that we see in many movies. My fate is to be with this particular person because they are the one for me. Action, right? I bring roses, and we've got the boom box, all the 1980s movies and things like that. Purpose, I'm going to win you back. I'm going to, we just have to take a chance together, and we'll find out that we're great people suited for each other, right? Just don't have any sequels. Fate, great romance. Love conquers all, whatever we want it to be. Something bigger, again, than the individual. We can also go the other way and say that we read this fate into the person's purposes and actions. Now, why? This all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Why then do we not get this? Why is this ruled out? Well, what's this section about? He says, this unity is for the consciousness just pleasure itself, or the simple, single feeling. Single could be also translated as individual, Einzelne, right? And the transition from the moment of its purpose into the moment of its true essence is for it a sheer leap into its antithesis. So we have a gap here. We have antithesis. Gegengesetze. Right? Let's apologize for the illegibility of that. Entgegengesetzte, set off against each other, opposed to each other as antitheses. We have a leap here. Things don't make sense. Things can't be put together in that way. There is no mediation at this point. So he says, well, what does this give us? He says, these moments are not contained and linked together in feeling, but only in the pure self, which is a universal or thought. Consciousness, therefore, through its experience, in which it should have found its truth, what does it discover instead? It has become a riddle to itself. The consequences of its deeds are not for it the deeds themselves. What befalls it is for it not the experience of what it is in itself. The transition is not a mere alteration of the form of the same content and essence. Instead, he says, the abstract necessity has the character of the merely negative, merely privative, you might say, uncomprehended power of universality, on which individuality is smashed to pieces. Fate, necessity, in terms of the one who is seeking pleasure, and remember that, in terms of the one who is seeking pleasure, not necessarily in terms of every individual whatsoever, but in terms of that particular drive, reveals itself as something that is radically alien and opposed to that cannot be mediated with it, and which is going to win in the end. This is as far as the manifestation of this form of self-consciousness goes. The final moment of its existence is the thought of the loss of itself in necessity, or the thought of itself as a being that is absolutely alien to it. However, self-consciousness has in itself survived this loss, for this necessity of pure universality is its own essence. This reflection of consciousness into itself, the knowledge that necessity is itself, is a new form of consciousness. We end this short subsection of pleasure and necessity with paragraph 366 with this particular shape of self-consciousness, the self-consciousness that is focused on pleasure, as falling into this pit of necessity where it is ground up, where it is destroyed, where it is smashed. Hegel has all this, very dramatic language with respect to it, where it finds only this alien necessity, or it finds the thought as a being, how Miller's translating Wesen, an essence that is alien to it, fremd, that is other to it. Now, there's actually some, good news here in a certain respect, as there almost always is in Hegel, isn't there? Right? He takes away with one hand, but always gives you something back, but it's never the same thing that he took away. So he says, this is as far as the manifestation of this form of self-consciousness goes. This form of self-consciousness. The book doesn't end there, right? We're moving into another section. So he says, the final moment of its existence is this thought of the loss of itself in necessity, or the thought of itself as a being that is absolutely alien to it. That's the pit of despair. However, how is it thinking that? Self-consciousness remains aware of itself going down into this pit. It is aware of that necessity. It is not completely lost in it, even as it feels that it is totally lost and destroyed in it. So he says, self-consciousness has in itself survived this loss. For itself, it feels as if it's lost everything, including itself. In itself, it has not. Now, this means that this remains implicit and has to be worked out because it's the in itself, not yet the in and for itself, right? But he says this necessity or pure universality is its own essence, is its own Wesen. So he says this reflection of consciousness into itself, the knowledge that necessity is itself, is what? A new form of self-consciousness. And what does that mean? That means that we're now ready to move into the analysis and the unfolding of a new gestalt. We've finished with this one. We've gone as far as it goes. We've seen that, pleasure can be certainly fun, but if we try to make that the meaning of history and reality, it fails pretty miserably, just like when we tried out with sense certainty, right? That means that now we move to something that's a bit more complex, a bit more adequate to what human life is, something richer. This is the transition point to the law of the heart.